NBC News brings you its young but widely experienced Washington reporter, the Washington correspondent for the Camel Caravan, Mr. David Brinkley.
The following program is brought to you in living color. Ladies and gentlemen, a good evening to you.
This is Lowell Thomas in New York.
The Beatles emerged off the American.
Go, my fellow Americans!
I'm Chet Huntley, your host on...
We had 73 television cameras on Mayday Girl.
President Nixon is actively...
One small step for man.
Good evening. A number of years back, David Brinkley was a guest on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. David observed to Johnny that given their years in television, the two of them had probably been seen and heard by more people than anyone else in human history. Certainly in his own case, David Brinkley wasn't exaggerating. He started with NBC News in 1943 in radio and moved to something new called television a few years later. Helped invent it, really. The Huntley-Brinkley Report, starting in 1956, established the model for evening news programs. David has been at the pinnacle of television news for more than half a century, the past 15 years with ABC. But on Sunday, November 10th, he retired as host of This Week with David Brinkley. A good time, we thought, to celebrate the first part of Brinkley's career, his 38 years with NBC News. Nothing definitive, mind you, just a sampler of David's remarkable body of work here over the years. Let's start with the day David Brinkley left NBC. September 18th, 1981. Tom Brokaw spoke with him on Today.
It occurs to me, here you and I are talking live on television back and forth from two different locations. When you came to NBC 38 years ago, this kind of thing was not exactly possible.
No, we used 2 baking powder cans with a wax string.
Radio was your primarily medium in those days.
Yeah, I started here writing news scripts for announcers to read on the air. And NBC paid me $60 to write them and paid the announcers $600 to read them. The economics of it came clear to me after a while.
We want to, David, if we can, just for a few moments, show 1 or 2 pieces of memory of David Brinkley from the days gone by. Here you are during the long night of the 1960 election, the very close race between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon.
David, if we keep switching around the country, we still may find a bold, uncautious soul. Sometime.
Well, we haven't found any here yet. We're still waiting for that one vote for Kennedy. It's 268, leads 269. Possibly the 501 is bolder than some of us. Maybe we can go downtown and find out. Well, we didn't project anything there. We're supposed to project the winner while they're still voting on the West Coast and antagonize them all.
David knows a thing or two about elections. Here he is talking to some Democrats about Harry Truman's surprise victory over the Republicans in 1948.
Here's another thing I would like to hear some comment on. Do you think the outcome might have been any different if the Republicans had run a different kind of campaign? If they had faced up to the issues a little more squarely, shall we say? Do you think that might have made any difference?
Dave, I think so. Cap, you were about to...
How about you?
Well, I think they've been still worse off because the instant they began taking positions, people would have caught up with them instantly. We wouldn't have done so much work. We had to carry the whole campaign, explain everything. All they did was say water's wet, grass is green, the sun shines, love is glorious.
Well, all those things are true, aren't they?
They was strong.
That was 1948. 4 years later, Truman wasn't running. Republican Dwight Eisenhower was. His running mate, a promising young congressman named Richard Nixon, controversial even then.
Last night at Wheeling, West Virginia, brought the meeting between Eisenhower and Nixon and a high peak of emotion that brought Nixon to tears. Later, in a cold, damp stadium, the general told the crowd the decision most of them knew already but wanted to hear anyway.
My colleague in this political campaign has been subject to a very unfair and vicious attack. So far as...
That was that, and a short time later, Nixon was back on his chartered airplane with his wife, going back to the speaking tour in the West he had interrupted.
Eisenhower and Nixon won that year, but in 1960, Nixon lost a close race for the top job. lost it to John F. Kennedy. David Brinkley reported on JFK's election, the 1,000 days of his presidency, and with chilling simplicity, the events of November 22nd, 1963.
Good evening. The essential facts are these. President Kennedy was murdered in Dallas, Texas. He was shot by a sniper hiding in a building near his parade route. He was dead within an hour. Lyndon Johnson is President of the United States. He took the oath of office in a jet airplane as he was returning from Dallas, where he went with Mr. Kennedy, coming back to Washington, where he is now. The late president's body has been returned here and arrived along with Mrs. Kennedy and President Johnson a short time ago. They came into Andrews Air Force Base just outside of Washington. Then President Johnson took a helicopter, flew to the White House, and went into a meeting immediately with the Secretary of Defense, McNamara, and McGeorge Bundy, who is the president's advisor on foreign policy.
In 1968, an assassin's bullet found Robert Kennedy. The Democrats self-destructed over Vietnam, and Richard Nixon staged a comeback. David Brinkley saw it all.
No martyr's cause was ever stilled by assassin's bullets, and in a very broad sense, no doubt that is true. Maybe Lincoln's cause was not stilled by assassin's bullets, but his cause after the Civil War, he said, was to bind the nation's wounds. But then they killed him, and the wounds were not bound. Instead, those who came after him, instead of binding the wounds, rubbed salt into them. And the wounds grew and spread so deeply into the American consciousness, they are not healed yet, 100 years later. When Senator Kennedy went down, he was trying to speak for those Americans, including the young, who feel a need to change many aspects of American life. Well, that cause has not been stilled forever, because even without him, the changes will be made, because they have to be. But nobody knows when, nor how, nor whether the changes will be made peacefully or violently.
I'll make it brief. It seems to me that on the last day of the Democratic Convention, the party could fairly be classified as a disaster area. Hubert Humphrey, after a long time of yearning for it, has finally won his party's nomination, and in the opinion of a great many people, including a great many of the delegates, there is serious question now about how much the nomination he won is worth.
As it turned out, in the late, tired hours of last night, or the early, tired hours of this morning, Richard Nixon won the election this time, where 8 years ago he lost it in Illinois. It was so close, it took forever, but he won it, and in winning that, he won the presidency. It was, again, one of the closest elections in American history, closer even than when Nixon lost to Kennedy 8 years ago. His lead over Humphrey in the popular vote is still only about 25,000 votes, or about 1/5 of a vote per precinct. There are states where we still don't know, even now, for certain, who won. But whichever way these states go now, they can't change the outcome.
Richard Nixon's presidency was turbulent. A low point came in 1973 with Nixon's firing of Watergate Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. Here's what David Brinkley said that night. And then on the night 10 months later, when Richard Nixon resigned.
Our history shows the American people will put up with a great deal, even when the demands on them are outrageous, as they often are. But they will not put up with anyone who claims to be, or tries to be, above the law, immune to the rules applying to everybody else. It seems to be known instinctively that if anyone acquires that privilege, it'll be the end of this country. The public will not obey laws they dislike if their leaders don't. It appears the White House, feeling threatened, has long since pulled its wagons into a circle and lost touch with what was happening outside. There is every evidence they were surprised by the degree of public anger at the events of last weekend. So the president backed down, said he'd hand over the tapes, whereas in the past he argued this was an intolerable invasion of his privacy. Well, other people's privacy is routinely invaded by the federal government, and anyone else who tried to withhold evidence that might bear on a crime would wind up in jail. It has always seemed doubtful that Congress could actually bring itself to impeach the president, but since Saturday night, it has seemed they might actually face up to it. So the president backed down because he had to.
A few random thoughts on coming out of what President Ford called a nightmare. Richard Nixon was re-elected to the White House in our greatest landslide, and in less than 2 years, he left the White House crying and wondering how he could pay his taxes. Regrettably, few countries in the world could have gone through the turmoil of changing government like this and got it all settled, while its military remained quietly in its barracks, minding its own business, playing checkers and drinking beer. If, as President Ford mentioned, nobody voted for him, either for vice president or president, then nobody voted against him either. And so he takes office with few enemies, and he can count on some period of help, support, and cooperation all around. He will make enemies only when he begins doing things. He can't wait as long as he might like. If Watergate is over, the inflation is not, and it's as destructive to a stable society as political scandal, if not more so. And the Constitution prescribes no remedy for it. Neither does it prescribe a remedy for the arrogantly powerful presidency that began long before Nixon, unless Congress can find the energy and the will to control it. This time, the Constitution worked, and the country has got through it. But if the Washington establishment, particularly Congress, cannot learn from this and do better in the future, not even Madison, Jefferson, and Hamilton can save it.
Flight is smooth, so far uneventful, perfectly on time, perfectly efficient. If you watched, or since you watched the liftoff with us, there's really nothing to say about it. What can you say about a sight like that? It's a sight that there's a huge crowd out here of reporters, visitors, VIPs, and others milling around and talking and gossiping and handshaking and telling jokes and making a lot of noise in a busy, vivid scene. And NASA has set up loudspeakers outside this area here, and so when the last minute or so of the countdown begins, they hear it over loudspeakers, 10, 9, 8, exactly as we all heard it. And it was notable that when it got down to about a minute, everybody who had been lollygagging, gossiping, talking, fell still and silent, knowing he was about to see something truly fantastic, but not really knowing what it was. We all know what we saw, but in another way, we don't know what we saw.
David Brinkley on the launch of Apollo 11 in 1969. America's space race with the Soviets was rooted in the Cold War, of course. In the early 50s, the struggle against communism was played out in Korea.
Today, Senator Lyndon Johnson tells us why he thinks we're having a hard time of it in Korea.
For too long, we have been more interested in making our books balance than in making our strength balance against the military power of communism. Far more dollars are being lost in South Korea than all the dollars we saved, if we have saved any at all.
25 years later came the humiliating end to the war in Vietnam, but not before it had cost President Johnson his job and 58,000 Americans their lives.
The end, when it came, was illuminated with red flares because there at the end of the tunnel, there was no other light. In the smoky red glare at the American embassy in Saigon, helicopters are flying from the rooftop, taking away the American staff members and the favored Vietnamese, who, by one means or another, got to go along. The one means or another included friends, influence, and money. Now, that was on the roof. Down on the ground, the Marines, performing their last military duty, were trying to stop the Vietnamese from climbing the embassy wall, storming the building, trying to get inside, hoping to get aboard a helicopter and leave the country before the communists came. The Marines stopped them at the top of the wall as they reached up for a handhold by striking them on the fingers. The war started with B-52 bombers and ended with the cracking of knuckles.
In addition to witnessing history, David Brinkley has seen history makers come and go over the years. On March 5th, 1963, came the death of Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin.
Today, President Eisenhower walked from the White House across West Executive Avenue to the old State Department building for his third news conference. On Stalin, he said this: he cannot say what effect his death would have on the world's struggle with communism. He just can't say. He does say the attitude of this government at this moment is one of watchfulness. He expressed the hope that regardless of personalities in any new regime in Russia, the goal of peace will be seriously pursued.
David noted the passing of a different sort of legend on August 16, 1977.
Good evening. Elvis Presley died today. He was 42. Apparently it was a heart attack. He was found at his home in Memphis, not breathing. His road manager tried to revive him. He failed. A hospital tried to revive him. It failed. His doctor pronounced him dead at 3 o'clock this afternoon. The end, at an early age, of one of the two most spectacular careers in the history of American entertainment, the other being Frank Sinatra's.
Not all the news David brought us was quite so serious. In the early 60s, he hosted a program called David Brinkley's Journal, television's first news magazine show. It was a grueling assignment.
How did you get along in your year as Miss America? Everything good?
No, not at all. Ups and downs. It's a very hard job. The money is good, but it's a difficult job. Most people think that it's a bed of roses, but actually it's very tiring. Of course, now, part of that was my fault. I didn't have to have such a heavy schedule.
The United States wants to come as close as it can to surrounding Russia with military bases, all of them equipped to fire missiles with atomic explosives and pointed toward Russia. Secretary Dulles told us today at his news conference that we will, at the Paris meeting in December, try to arrange with our European allies something like this. Nuclear weapons designed for rockets and other uses would be stored in European countries under our control, but for their use in case of a war. We already have an arrangement like this with the British. The plan now is to extend it to other countries on the continent of Europe.
November 1956, and one of the earliest installments of the Huntley-Brinkley Report. NBC's Chet Huntley and David Brinkley set the pace in television news for 14 years, until Huntley's retirement on July 31st, 1970.
And David, thanks for these years of happy association, and for being such an easy colleague to work with, and for all the kindnesses.
Chet, I too would like to thank all of those who tune us in and put up with us, particularly including those who write the nasty letters. McGee and Chancellor and I will be here every night, and we'll miss you. Last night, NBC had a dinner for Chet and gave all of us a chance to say goodbye to him, and as a farewell gift, NBC gave him a horse. So, Chet, when you ride away to the west, to Montana, on your new horse, I will have to admit to at least a mild envy. And when you're out there under clear skies and clean air, maybe once in a while you will think of those of us still here, fighting the traffic, the transportation breakdown, strikes, pollution, and wondering what is left that we can eat, drink, smoke, or breathe that will not kill us, and wondering what horror will be visited upon us next. In these years, I have often been stopped in public by people polite who knew I was either Huntley or Brinkley, but weren't sure which, and so they would ask. Well, from now on, when somebody stops me in the street and says, "Aren't you Chet Huntley?" I have an answer. It is no man. He is the one out on the... I really don't want to say it, but the time has come, and so for the last time, good luck and good night, Chet.
Good luck, David, and good night for NBC.
11 years later, the talk was of Brinkley as the one on the horse. David was leaving NBC News, and Tom Brokaw spoke with him on Today.
Well, David, you'll be grateful to know that I could not find the one scene that I really wanted, which was David Brinkley on a cattle roundup in New Mexico doing his closer on a horse that did not move, not even a muscle, during the course of the entire closer. And we had calls of protest from all over the country saying, "You've put Brinkley on a stuffed horse." Do you remember that?
I do, and it infuriated me. I've been riding that horse for 6 days, herding cattle. And I did a little, sat on the horse and talked for a minute or so on the camera, and the horse never moved. And people said, stuffed. It was infuriating. It wasn't stuffed. It was a real horse.
I did go back. I do remember going back and looking very carefully, and we did see the horse blink its eye one time.
Well, if I'd realized it, I'd have kicked him and made him move a little bit. But it was a real horse. I love to ride horses.
David Brinkley, no tricks, no gimmicks, straightforward, saying more in a phrase than the rest of us could say in hundreds of words. I cannot tell you how much you have meant to me and my professional career, and well, I'll miss you around NBC. What I'm especially grateful for is that I'll still have your friendship, and we'll still have that relationship.
You certainly will, and thank you, Tom.
Thank you, and good luck, David.
David Brinkley decided recently to bring to an end his career at NBC News, which spans 38 years, and go on to other work. His appearance tonight on the NBC magazine with David Brinkley will be his final one at NBC. He began in television in the old days of fuzzy black and white pictures on little screens. Since then, he's done it all. As a writer, he is simply the best. As a stylist, he's impossible to imitate, although a lot of people have tried. Many memories around here tonight.
Finally, I regret to say this is my last broadcast on NBC. I leave here in good health, goodwill, with good wishes for the network where I have worked most of my life. NBC has some new leadership now, the best it has had in years, and I hope and believe it will do well. A great many of you and I have grown up together, and together we have elected some presidents and buried some and started some wars and ended some and explored the moon and a great deal more. And a number of you in your 30s have told me that I helped you get through public affairs classes in high school. I was very happy to hear that. The first news story I ever wrote on a small-town newspaper was 2 sentences long, and the big news in it was that the city of Wilmington, North Carolina, was about to repaint the stripe down the middle of 3rd Street. 2 sentences. Probably should have been 1. Well, NBC has made it possible for me to do whatever I have done since then, and wherever I wind up working, and I will work on the air, I will always be grateful for that. This program will continue and will be even better. For my friends and colleagues here on NBC Magazine and throughout NBC, on the air and off, thank you, and good night.
As we've seen tonight, David Brinkley's work stands the test of time, a rare quality in journalism, not to mention television. Throughout his almost 4 decades with NBC News, David was a skilled newsman, a gifted writer, insightful observer, and a valuable colleague. We were fortunate to have him, and in 1981, sorry to see him go. The good news, you can catch him regularly here on Time and Again. Good night, David. That's Time and Again for now. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jane Pauley, and we're history.
We have been all over this country and have seen abundant life and more liberty than there is anywhere else. And in a country as remorselessly self-critical as this one, constantly discussing its own faults, it was astonishing to find so many people saying, yes, they're happy.
Kidding? Go